Besides the elements of art and the principles of design, one of the most important things to understand is probably composition. Composition is defined as the art of organizing elements of artwork into a harmonious and pleasing whole, the consideration of how objects are placed in a design or work of art. There are any number of things that make for good composition, and here are several important tips. Place objects slightly over one another. This will get the eye to move from one element to another. Objects should not be touching each other by edges. This is referred to as kissing. This is true for both graphics and illustration. Here the objects all appear to be lined up as if on parade. You should also avoid isolation where objects seem to be floating about the frame. Build a relationship between objects in the artwork rather than to have them sitting about aimlessly. This is a good example of overlap. None of the larger objects appear to line up with the centers of the one that they are overlapping. In illustration, objects might overlap from largest to smallest, but it is not entirely necessary. Just as with isolation, try to avoid objects that are too small and provide too much white space around them. Again, with illustration, the same rule applies. Too much white space and no interrelationship. Good graphic design allows for objects to crop off from the artboard area and to overlap. Consider having objects go off the edge of the page. This gets the viewer in and out of the picture. The same is true in illustration. Don't try to put everything dead center in the picture plane. Make allowances for some objects to disappear and avoid floating objects within the edges of the page. Avoid having all the elements upright and perpendicular to one another. Now this might be pressing things and may not be the best example, but consider placing objects at an angle. Things that are tilted create a more dynamic composition. Artwork with objects that are perfectly lined up with the edge can be boring. Avoid objects that are the same size in the composition. This is true in illustration as well. Create an area of importance. Give the viewer something to focus on. One way to achieve this is through size variation. Try not to have all the elements the same size. Another way to create focus is through color dominance. Avoid placing objects directly in the center of the page. Think about placing objects slightly to one side. This will create a more interesting composition. Try to keep elements balanced as you do this. For example, one large object could be balanced by three smaller ones. Again, as this image demonstrates, this does not mean that a symmetrical design cannot be successful. Now, these are only tips. You should experiment continually, and that's the reason why we do so many different roughs as we're doing things. It allows you to take a look at various things and say to yourself, well, I like the elements and I like the way that things are placed in this rough design, and I also like the way that some of these are placed in this particular rough design, and then later on you can kind of marry the two up by way of creating a more optimal design.